We're journalists who revealed previously unreleased video and audio of the flawed medical response to the Uvalde shooting. Ask us anything. Edit. That's, technically, all the time we have for today, but we'll do our best to answer as many remaining questions as we can in the next hours and days. Thank you all for the fantastic questions, and please continue to follow our coverage and support our journalism. We can't do these investigations without reader support. Proof. Link. Law enforcement's well-documented failure to confront the shooter who terrorized Robb Elementary for 77 minutes was the most serious problem in getting victims timely care, experts say. But previously unreleased records, obtained by The Washington Post, The Texas Tribune and ProPublica, for the first time show that communication lapses and muddled lines of authority among medical responders further hampered treatment. The chaotic scene exemplified the flawed medical response captured in video footage, investigative documents, interviews and radio traffic that experts said undermined the chances of survival for some victims of the May 24 massacre. 2 teachers and 19 students died. Ask reporters Lomi Creel, ProPublica, Zach Despart, Texas Tribune, Joyce Lee, Washington Post, and Sarah Callan, Washington Post, anything. Read the full story from all 3 newsrooms who contributed reporting to this investigative piece. Texas Tribune. Link. ProPublica. Link. The Washington Post. Link. If approved, allowed, requested by the parents, would you suggest releasing the pictures of the victims to ensure the reality of what happened is not dulled, muted? My historical link would be the bravery of Emmett Till's mother to display her son's body to ensure all who saw knew what occurred. I have always felt this act was one of a few key moments that served as a tipping point of our nation's history. Another great question, and one that I think a lot of journalists wrestle with in mass shootings. There really isn't any other way to put this, but the photos and videos of the Uvalde victims are horrific. We made a decision to capture these details in writing, because we don't want to sanitize what happened to these children and adults, but we felt the images themselves would be too upsetting to readers. We have been in contact with victims' families, to ensure they know ahead of time what we plan to publish and, importantly, why. Their consensus was that they don't want those images published. And while they don't dictate our coverage, we respect that. ZD. Why can't you upset readers? I mean, from a business point, I understand that there is a fear of someone picking up a paper or online aerials and just going, oh fuck these guys, I didn't want to see this. Unsubscribe. But shouldn't people be upset? And alluding to the original question, does it address the "this is fake" crowd that is absurdly large? I feel like journalistic responsibility is supposed to report what happened, and over the years that is being discredited for not enough proof. At what point does it turn into, well, here is photo evidence, trust us yet? Hello. Oof, this is a tough one. One thing is that local officials have so far refused to publicly release the autopsy results and photographs. And I think certainly approval from the families would be key, as you note, but also weighing the public interest. Some of the images that we have obtained are unfortunately very difficult to see, as you can imagine. An interesting question that I think merits careful discussion. From Sarah Callan. This is a really important question. One thing we aim to do is make sure people have a choice in what content they consume. So, when publishing graphic visuals, we don't loop videos. Add a graphic slate to the beginning of the video and create a share image that is not graphic. Given that the response to one of these events is usually at the local level, how can the public find out if there is a good response plan in place for their community? Are disaster and BD coordination plans considered public information? How can we hold our police, EMS, fire coordinators responsible before a tragedy instead of after? This is a great question. Zach and I worked on a story that addressed parts of this about DPS, role and responsibility in Uvalde. Link. Many of the experts we talked to said all law enforcement and first responder agencies in a region should be signing off on active shooter response plans and be involved in deciding exactly how the chain of command would work so that everyone is clear on that. They should also practice and train together regularly. Unfortunately, in small or rural areas, cost can be a huge prohibitive to this here. I think as citizens in an area we should press public officials on what their response plans are and how they would handle such events, make sure they have a plan. Often the specifics of the plan are not public, but certainly pressing police, EMS, fire, mayor, school board on what their plans are. For example, I have obtained active shooter plans from the Houston and San Antonio school districts and police that in many cases specifically outline who will take charge. Also making sure that in areas where paramedic, ambulance companies are private and/or volunteer, they do frequent trainings with the relevant law enforcement bodies. Whether this happens and how often should be public in most areas. I would expect. The only issue with this is that what happens when they refuse to adhere to training. You can pay for more and more training, but it does no good if officers refuse to follow it. The Uvalde PD had active shooter training literally at Robb Elementary just prior to the actual shooting. They knew what to do. They just chose not to do it. Obviously, there were a lot of aspects of the police and medical response that leaves us surprised, saddened, and frustrated. But you guys have presumably spent a lot more time thinking about this than those of us in the public. What aspects of your investigation did you find most surprising? From Sarah Callan. Yes, there were a lot of surprising finds. First thing that comes to mind is how flaws in the response to Uvalde happened at other shootings. It's quite jarring to read action report after action report outlining the same failures. When we told one expert that the streets were blocked and ambulances couldn't get through, he said that's common. I've never seen a cop who didn't park like a total asshole. Paramedic here. I can't tell you the number of times a cop has blocked a driveway making access difficult for my partner and they're great at rushing into shit they have no business being involved in, then getting pissy when they find they're blocked in by an ambulance or fire apparatus, hoses. If a cop parks too close to the house that's on fire, they aren't going anywhere once those 4 or 5-inch supply lines are laid down pressurized. I rolled up to a scene one day to find the cop parker right in front of the hydrant that the engine company needed to access. The large majority of cops think rules don't apply to them, so this isn't shocking at all. I'd love for firefighters to knock out police windows to get to a hydrant like they do any other car. It's simply not plausible that the police were trying to help. They had the organization and initiative to stop people who were trying to help. Their problem was a combination of cowardice and total disregard for the lives of anyone who wasn't a cop or a cop's family. What makes you think they were trying to help? Interviews after the fact? The response speaks for itself, emo. I remember that quite a while after the 2021 King Soopers shooting suspect in Boulder, CO had been taken into custody, there was a ridiculous sea of police cars parked down the main road with the lights flashing. I wouldn't be surprised if there were 100. It was like something out of the Blues Brothers. It seems a similar thing happened at Uvalde. I appreciate it's not exactly in the scope of this investigation, but peripherally, did you ever find anything out about the rationale behind this? Are more officers than is apparently necessary attending such scenes out of morbid curiosity, or because of protocol? What does this mean for other areas that are left presumably unpoliced? Might a coordinated attack take advantage of this behavior, and are the police aware of that? The Texas House Committee report from July tallied 376 officers who responded that day. We noted at the time this force was larger than the garrison that defended the Alamo in 1836. Linked many officers responded because the school was in their primary jurisdiction. Other responding police worked outside Uvalde but had children or relatives who worked at Robb Elementary. At one point a state police commander asked for every trooper in the region to come. And a Border Patrol SWAT team working near the Texas-Mexico border, 50 miles away, responded when they heard about the shooting. What was particularly frustrating was that a review of the body camera and school surveillance footage showed the initial responding officers had everything they needed to confront and subdue the shooter, including the same type of rifle he had. Officers simply failed to do so. And the arrival of additional officers, at some point, actually made the response worse. None of the arriving police, even those with senior ranks, took overall command of the scene. Police vehicles parked on adjacent streets hampered the movement of ambulances. And many officers were tasked with corralling an increasingly agitated crowd of parents that had gathered outside a crowd that would not have had time to form had police followed active shooter protocol and kept engaging the shooter until he was subdued. ZD. Do you know of any politicians that have any good plans for fixing the chain of command issues that arose? Plans with budgets and timelines, that is, not just well wishes and thoughts. From Sarah Callan. Thanks for the question. Unfortunately, chain of command issues is a persistent problem at mass casualty events. In several cases, the communication problems resulted in delays in getting medical treatment to victims. A Justice Department review of the response to the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando that killed 49 people found that the police and fire department's decision to operate separate command posts for hours led to a lack of coordination. Experts told us an effective response to mass casualty events depends largely on the area's policies, level of training and coordination between departments, all of which vary across the country. I've been a paramedic for 12 years and sadly it is the same problem over and over again at these mass shootings. Complete inability to coordinate across agencies, lack of planning between agencies, no unified command. It is always the same and it never gets fixed. Nothing changed in Aurora after the theater shooting. Where I work we cover 2 counties and one of the county dispatch centers won't let us access their radio channels since we are not part of their county. We rely on the fire departments we cover to provide us with radios that we can use. I also don't see the federal government making any effort to require better coordination or planning. It is entirely up to local agencies to create mass casualty plans. It is just very frustrating to see the same issues on repeat. And every time there is a major incident you get the hint that a true mass casualty will be a disaster but everyone just ignores it. Hello. Lomi from ProPublica. This is a great question. At the moment, we are still waiting for the Texas Department of Public Safety to conclude their investigation. They have sent a preliminary report to the Uvalde County District Attorney, but that has not yet been made public. Our colleagues at the Texas Tribune recently wrote about that link that will be crucial in determining who all is to blame for the chain of command issues and how to address that going forward in other mass shootings, big disasters, emergencies. In the meantime, several officers from Uvalde Police Department, Uvalde School District, and the Department of Public Safety have been terminated, suspended, or retired or quit after questions about their lack of action that day. Great, and important question. It's a bit difficult to answer because while the head of the Texas State Police, Steve McCraw, in June said all police who responded collectively failed, no agency has done a public accounting of how their response was flawed. A State House of Representatives report released in July had a pretty damning passage on this point. Uvalde CISD and its police department failed to implement their active shooter plan and failed to exercise command and control of law enforcement responding to the tragedy. But these local officials were not the only ones expected to supply the leadership needed during this tragedy. Hundreds of responders from numerous law enforcement agencies, many of whom were better trained and better equipped than the school district police, quickly arrived on the scene. Those other responders, who also had received training on active shooter response and the interrelation of law enforcement agencies, could have helped to address the unfolding chaos. Yet in this crisis, no responder seized the initiative. There's an unresolved chain of command question about who should be in charge during active shooting events. On paper, UCISD Chief Pete Arredondo was the incident commander. But his department only had 6 officers, begging the question of why a larger agency, like the better trained and equipped state police, didn't take charge once they arrived. This was the subject of a story Lomi I wrote last year. Link. Because they all want to LARP as SEAL Team 6. All hat, no cattle. I legitimately believe you are correct with this. When I read Arredondo's first interview with his lawyer, this is exactly the impression I got. He wanted to be the big man to take out the shooter and be hailed the hero. Of course he didn't want to actually go into that room and confront the shooter. He sat in the hallway waiting for the shooter to come out. The same reason he didn't want or think he needed his radio, he didn't want it hampering him. Same reason he wouldn't leave the action to be the incident command. Then the shooter screwed it up for him. Seriously, how many shooters go into one room only and never come out? But when it became apparent the psychopath wasn't going to jump in front of his gun, he sat there inventing 1,000 reasons he couldn't go in. It's a barricaded, got no key, class is empty, etc., etc. And the rest of them were happy to play along. I've worked with fools like this, not but on a code team, and we routinely get the first year or new NP who's not happy just yelling EPI and time but wants to jump on the chest and then jump off to push meds, do the defib themselves, distract. Everyone with wild goose chases or theories calling for stat MRIs and other nonsense. They get in everyone's way and slow everything down. This is precisely why people like him get jobs like this in the first place. They want all of the respect without taking any of the risk. This man would have never been chief in any high crime department. I bet he asks his wife to call him chief during. Law enforcement is full of these fools. I am so sick of hearing how much better the response would be if there was an appropriate incident command. Talk to people who respond every day. It's a protocol. Memorize the protocol. The protocol for active shooter is pretty simple. Take them out. That's it. Everyone there knew that protocol. Let's be honest and admit what causes these multiple systemic failures already. Cops don't want to confront Arkansas 15-wielding shooters. There. That's it. No need for 17 committee investigations. Columbine, Pulse, Aurora, Parkland etc. They don't want to risk their lives or those of their fellow officers. That's the reason you get 377 or so people willing to handcuff and taser parents and listening to the moans of dying children while standing around. I hope they are literally haunted every night for the rest of their lives. The only thing an incident command could have really done to help would have been to coordinate parking, logistics, help direct rescues etc. But of course had they done their jobs within the first 1/2 hour or so they probably wouldn't have accumulated 800 cop cars and 1,000-person crowd. 911 wouldn't have been blown up to the same extent, they wouldn't have needed the assistance of 110 other organizations, and they could have maybe spared someone to call the helicopters and tell them to move in. Also, and this won't be a popular opinion, but we could get better responses if we handed out badges to and promoted people up the ranks who show the intelligence and critical thinking ability to actually handle their authority. A badge and a gun grants an awful lot of unearned authority and it attracts like a magnet all the so-called alpha males and females, who can't wait to be obeyed but can't think their way out of a paper bag. This is why we have so many officers shooting unarmed folks. The cops in Uvalde showed an extreme lack of critical thinking ability. I get the value of analyzing these things on a systems level, and I do believe that improvements can be made by doing so, but at the end of the day you have to start with officers willing to jump into the line of fire to save innocent folks. I truly believe this was the missing component here. Most of these officers should never see any type of police work again. IMHO. I don't often see different news sources working together, so I'm curious if the reason y'all combined forces was because of the drastic decrease in the number of investigative journalists following the demise of print and slow media or something else. Also, do y'all see joining forces being a common thing in the future? Thank you for this question. This was the first collaboration between our 3 news organizations in Texas, and one we are very proud of because, as you say, it is rare to work together like that. In this case, I think we all had various parts of the information and various expertise, and we thought partnering would provide the best answers. It has been really difficult to get information on Uvalde. And we hope to join forces more in the future when it makes sense for a project or investigation. We thought this one worked really well in leveraging each news organization's strengths. Beyond what Lomi said, given the traumatic nature of the coverage, it made more sense for our 3 organizations to work together rather than contacting all of these sources, including families and first responders, separately. A common refrain we've heard from sources in Uvalde is they're deluged with interview requests, which can be exhausting. We were able to limit those and still produce an investigation we think broke a lot of new ground. From Joyce Lee. Body cameras show first responders setting up a triage area inside the school, advising officers in the hallway to open medical kits and calling for medics to stand by. There were actually 3 ambulances at the school prior to the shooting, but one left carrying a wounded teacher from room 109 around 25 minutes before the breach. More ambulances were stationed nearby but were delayed in reaching the school because the streets were crammed with law enforcement vehicles. I've been a paramedic for 12 years. If I had $1 for every time I saw this exact thing, I wouldn't be a paramedic. This was also a big problem at the Aurora shooting, and probably others.